Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Walter Edwards. I'm the director of the Humanities Center, and I see in the audience one of my previous bosses, Carlin Shields, is in the house. So she just completed a wonderful year, 2 years as a member of the Center's Advisory Board. And so thank you for your service, Carlin. Today we are listening to a talk on Black, Blue, and Blue, the effects of race and criminal history on the perception of police violence. And we have two presenters, one Jason Smith, who is a PhD student in the sociology department, and Professor David Merolla, who is an associate professor in that department. Jason has had a stellar career in the sociology department. He graduated with a BA in 2017 and with an MA in sociology in 2019, and he's currently a PhD student. And while there, he has been the recipient of several awards, the Lucille Makarov Memorial Scholarship in 2015, the Best Poster Presentation for Finding Bias Online News Reporting of the Freddie Gray case. She's also gotten the Sociology Research Award in 2016, and the A-grade scholarship in 2017, the Sociology Department Alumni Award in 2018, and the Graduate Professional Scholarship in 2018 and 2019. He does research on race, racism, and public opinion, and police violence. So we're in the presence of an upward mobile great student in the sociology department. He is mentored and his presentation partner today is David Merolla. I have to say, I know David is a very modest man, and thanking him is something that he might not want me to do, but I still remember the wonderful 2 years that David served as a member of the Center's Advisory Board. In those days, we used to have something called the Fall Symposium, where we identify a particular topic and we get people from within the university and a keynote speaker to come and address that topic. And he was a member of the advisory board from 2013 to 2015. And in 2014, 15, he took on the task of organizing a fall symposium on the topic Re the City. And it was very interesting way in which he conceptualized it, sort of reworking, re-energizing, re-immigrating, populating, regenerating, and so on. And he organized that symposium into a variety of themes, and it has been, without doubt, the most successful fall symposium we've ever had. We were able to attract so many people that we had concurrent sessions, and he brought to be the keynote speaker Professor William Julius Wilson, who is a distinguished professor from Harvard, and David was able to get him to come very modestly with no fanfare. And he's also been a wonderful friend of the center. And he has given several Brownback talks. And recently, when the police violence against African Americans became the focus of attention, I asked a current member of our advisory board, R. Kahari Brown, to see if he can get somebody to address this topic. And he asked David, and being a friend of the center, he has gotten together with his mentee, and they are giving this talk. David received his PhD at Kent State University in 2010, and subsequently joined the Department of Sociology here at Wayne. He's a scholar of race, racism, social psychology, and education. And he's the author of over 20 articles and chapters. He is an excellent teacher, as evidenced by the fact that in 2013, he received the President's Award for Excellence in Teaching. And in 2018, he received the Outstanding Graduate Mentor Award. At the time the Graduate Mentor Award was created, I was Associate Dean of the graduate school, and I created that award. And it was meant to reward people like David, who spend so much time mentoring students. So when he got that award, I felt justified for the work I put into organizing and getting that award accepted. And he currently serves as the director of the graduate studies in the Department of Sociology. So thank you very much for both of you for agreeing to give this talk. And I mention again that the title of the talk is Black, Blue, and Blow, the Effect of Race and Criminal History on Perceptions of Police Violence. So over to the speakers.
Thanks, Walter.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Dave, should we get started? Yeah. Look good? Okay, so as you heard, the title of this research is Black, Blue, and Blow, the Effect of Race and Criminal History on Perceptions of Police Violence. So back in 2012, we saw the incident where Trayvon Martin was shot by 28-year-old George Zimmerman, the neighborhood watch coordinator of his neighborhood in Florida. And although the specifics of the event remain in dispute, media reports immediately following the event suggested that Zimmerman had pursued the unarmed Martin on foot and instigated a physical confrontation that culminated in Martin's death. 911 recordings indicated that Zimmerman, who had a history of calling the police on young Black men in his neighborhood, had assumed Martin was a criminal and described him in derogatory terms to the dispatcher. Then, 2 years later, we have the case where Michael Brown was fatally shot by Ferguson, Missouri officer Darren Wilson. And again, while controversy surrounds the exact sequence of events, what is not in dispute is that Michael Brown was unarmed and he was shot by Officer Wilson only about a minute and a half after Wilson first approached Brown. Although Zimmerman and Wilson eventually faced criminal charges for these incidents, both were acquitted by juries of any wrongdoing. And although Zimmerman was not officially a police officer, these events and the subsequent deaths of Freddie Gray, Eric Gardner, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Philando Castile, Stephen Clark, and a host of others have cast the polarizing issue of police brutality against Black men into the national spotlight. So protests against police violence have erupted in cities across the country, and Black Lives Matter has become a rallying cry for a new civil rights movement fighting for social justice. At the same time, recent polling data indicates that respect for police among Americans has never been higher, and this Blue Lives Matter has become a counter movement, alleging that police brutality is not a systemic social problem. Proponents of this position maintain that Black Lives Matter is a misguided undertaking that vilifies police officers who are simply protecting themselves against legitimate threats in a dangerous job. Black Lives Matter seeks in part to raise public awareness of the ongoing disparities in treatment that Black Americans face at the hands of police. The movement argues that general anti-Black sentiment in society allows police to shoot unarmed Black men with near impunity. For example, social media memes associated with Black Lives Matter often point to the contrast between white murder suspects like Dylan Roof, who are respectfully apprehended and fed Burger King, and unarmed Black men who have been shot by the police for far less severe circumstances. Given continued evidence of prejudice and discrimination within society, as well as stereotypes of Black men as criminal and threatening, it follows that individuals might perceive police violence as more justified when directed at Black men. However, little social science research has sought to isolate the situational factors of police-citizen interactions that shape individuals' perceptions of whether police violence toward a citizen is justified. And this paper aimed to address this issue. So we used an experimental survey design, and we wanted to understand how situational features of police-citizen interactions shape public perceptions of these incidents. Specifically, we asked whether a citizen's race and criminal history affect whether individuals perceive police violence against them as justified. And additionally, we asked if these effects are moderated by individual racial prejudice. So since the end of Jim Crow and the emergence of the civil rights movement, the prevalence of overt or old-fashioned prejudice characterized by a belief in biological superiority has declined. However, rather than being supplanted by this large-scale belief in racial equality, old-fashioned racism has instead been replaced by more subtle forms of racial prejudice. Individuals who subscribe to these new forms of prejudice are often termed modern racism, symbolic racism, or colorblind racism, continue to hold negative attitudes towards people of color. However, rather than attributing these negative attitudes to any innate racial differences, they attribute these attitudes to cultural and behavioral characteristics of racial minorities. In this way, new racism is far more subtle than overt racial hostility, and it allows individuals to harbor socially acceptable racial animus without being labeled a racist by society at large. So along these lines, a large body of research demonstrates that well into the 21st century, the American public continues to perceive Black Americans as being far more prone to criminal offending than crime statistics suggest. And this phenomenon is referred to as the racialization of crime or racial typification of crime. So although the stereotype of Black criminality stretches back to slavery, this belief became even more pronounced after the civil rights movement. Coinciding with the war on drugs, the US saw a significant expansion of the criminal justice system from the mid-70s through the 90s, with the number of Americans incarcerated increasing fourfold over that time. This expansion of the criminal justice system happened concurrent with moral panic surrounding inner city youth gangs and rap music, which contributed to even greater racialization of crime as terms like thug and super predator became synonymous with young Black men. The phenomenon of linking race and criminality occurs in part through media portrayals that mold the public's belief about crime and which groups have a proclivity toward criminal offending. Research on local news broadcasts indicates that these broadcasts depict a very specific image of crime, partially due to the practice of promoting lurid, sensational stories. These broadcasts present an image of crime that is overwhelmingly young, violent, and Black. And a general script in local news indicate that young Black men from the inner city routinely commit violent crimes, often targeting law-abiding suburban whites. And through such coverage, the media disproportionately portray Black men as dangerous people who are liable to prey on whites, leading many whites to perceive Black men as more prone to violent criminal behavior. The result of the racialization of crime is that the public in turn supports punitive criminal justice policies targeted at Black Americans. And the research literature is fairly consistent in showing that whites who perceive Black Americans as more criminal are also more likely to support aggressive policing tactics like stop and frisk and the war on drugs, because they understand that these policies should be targeted primarily at Black Americans. Importantly, the evidence on the link between Black criminality and support for punitive criminal justice policies is consistent with the theories of modern racism that I described earlier. Whites who espouse these beliefs don't need to endorse innate biological white supremacy. Instead, they can just justify their support for punitive criminal justice measures based on their exaggerated views of the criminality of Black Americans. So in many recent high-profile cases of police violence, Americans who are sympathetic toward the police justify the officer's actions not based on the race of the citizen or even the citizen's action during the encounter. Instead, individuals and the media often reference a person's prior criminal history as evidence that the individual posed a threat to police. For example, although neither Walter Scott, Mike Brown, Philando Castile, or Freddie Gray were engaging in a crime when confronted by police, there was nevertheless rampant media speculation about their prior criminal histories when constructing the narrative surrounding their deaths. Research shows that media tends to emphasize the criminal aspects of citizens who are targets of police violence. And these references to the unrelated criminal histories, often irrelevant to the incident, temper public sympathy for citizens while simultaneously validating the fears reported by engaging officers by playing on the general social stigma faced by individuals with criminal backgrounds. And additionally, by referencing the criminal history of Black men in particular, the media may frame the individual as a thug, essentially drawing on the racial typification of crime described earlier to portray the target of police brutality as a dangerous threat. Drugs are also a particularly relevant part of a past criminal history because individuals with a history of drug use are generally viewed negatively by the public. So in context of police violence, drug users may be framed as volatile and unpredictable. We saw this recently with the framing of George Floyd as a fentanyl addict whose drug use contributed to his death. However, that was later refuted by a second autopsy report. Another example of using unrelated drug use to justify violence was the 2016 case of Philando Castile. During a traffic stop, the officer shot Castile 7 times, killing him just feet away from his fiancée and daughter who were in the vehicle with him. The officer excused his behavior by claiming that he feared for his life, not because of any specific action from Castile, but because he smelled marijuana, and he basically equated marijuana use to potentially murdering a police officer. And in this way, Yanez frames Castile as a dangerous threat due to his drug use. All this evidence surrounding the use of criminal history generally, and drug use in particular, to frame citizens involved in police violence indicates that individuals may perceive police violence as more justified against a citizen with a history of drug crimes. So the situational features of a police-citizen interaction may not shape perceptions of police brutality uniformly for everybody, right? Instead, people may react differently to situations based on their individual characteristics. One potentially important factor is the endorsement of racial prejudice. A large body of evidence indicates that individuals who have high levels of racial animus also tend to favor harsh punitive criminal justice policies. Again, the link between racial resentment and support for punitive policing measures is characteristic of modern racism. Mainly, it appears, though, that many individuals will argue in favor of harsh policing strategies, particularly in communities of color, but will justify these beliefs as a rational response to rampant crime rather than an overt effort to repress people of color. So given these patterns, we expect that individuals with higher levels of racial prejudice will see police violence as more justified, and the effect of a citizen's race will be stronger among those with higher levels of racial prejudice. So to summarize, a large body of research indicates that Americans view Black men as more criminal and prone to violence than their white counterparts. And furthermore, research shows that the racialization of crime leads to support for punitive policing and criminal justice measures. However, less research has sought to determine whether Americans also support harsher police treatment of Black citizens during traffic stops. So this research seeks to determine whether race plays a role in how individuals perceive police violence. And here we have our hypotheses. And we anticipated that respondents will rate police violence towards a Black citizen as more justified than against a white citizen. Respondents will rate police violence towards a citizen with a criminal history as more justified than someone without. And there will be a positive association between racial prejudice and perceived justification of police violence. And finally, the positive effect of Black citizen on justification will be stronger for people with higher levels of racial prejudice. Now I'm going to send it over to Dr. Merolla so he can elaborate on our survey methodology, results interpretation, and discussion.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Yep, perfect. All right, thanks, Jay. Great job. So to investigate our hypotheses, as Jay alluded to, we used the survey experimental methodology. And this survey was administered in March 2017 through the Amazon MTREC system. That's where we recruited our respondents, and we developed a 2x2 survey experimental design. So for this design, the respondents were basically presented with a short news article that was designed to mimic a violent police-citizen encounter. The news article basically described a citizen complaining that they had suffered from facial lacerations and a fractured wrist as a result of harsh treatment during a traffic stop. They were pulled over for I think a taillight was out, and then they ended up being sort of pulled from the vehicle violently, thrown to the ground, and then handcuffed in a violent manner. The article similarly had a quote from a police officer's attorney that, with typical rhetoric in these types of incidents that said, the police officer was responding to a legitimate threat, the person was acting erratically, and they thought the person was reaching for a weapon, when the citizen, the motorist, said they were sort of trying to find their license. So I know you can't read that, but I was pretty proud of the fake internet news story that we came up with in terms of how it looked. So this was basically what the respondents were presented with, but it, in a way that you could read it. So in order to set up our design here, we had our two independent variables were citizen race and criminal history. So for race, the citizen was identified as either Jermaine Jackson, a 26-year-old black man, or Bradley Miller, a 26-year-old white man. And after reviewing numerous articles, sort of in this type of design, sometimes people just use the names to signal the race of the person. In this case, most articles that report on these types of incidents, they specifically state the race of the motorist. So similarly for criminality, the vignette indicated that the person had either no criminal record or had been in prison numerous times for numerous crimes, including cocaine possession. So that was, again, sort of noted in that vignette. So there's two possible values for race, black and white, and two possible values for criminality, no criminal record or has a criminal record, which again sort of sets up our 2x2 design. Our dependent variable, right, we're mostly interested in whether people viewed the police actions during the stop as violent or as justified. And we knew of no existing survey or scale that measured this. And so we developed 6-item scale that sort of mirrored sentiments that we saw when looking at comments on newspaper articles and other sort of social media. So some examples of the items, the statements for this scale were: the motorist had cooperated with the officer, he wouldn't have been physically assaulted, the officer was just doing his job, this incident shows that police are too aggressive these days. So really the types of things that we saw when people sort of debate these instances, whether or not they agree with these types of sentiments. And we had a strong reliability there. So for our control variables and moderator, our moderator, hypothesis 4 suggests that the main effect for a black citizen will be moderated by individual prejudice. And we operationalize that using a pretty well-known measure, the symbolic racism scale. And this is a scale that was developed around 2000 to really capture these more cultural or symbolic aspects of racial prejudice. And so a lot of the items, basically, if you have a high value on this, you sort of endorse the sentiment that continuing racial disparities are primarily due to behavioral and cultural characteristics of racial minorities, and simultaneously you oppose any action to rectify those disparities. We just have some control variables. We control for gender, age, political ideology, urban residents, and college graduate. So the results. So our first hypothesis suggested that citizens, did I mention we only used white respondents. So our first hypothesis suggested that white respondents would view violence against a black motorist as more justified. That hypothesis was in fact not supported. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here in model 1 and model 2, right, the main effect here for black motorists is not significant. So across the whole sample, we don't find any evidence that whites view just violence toward black motorists as more justified compared to a white motorist. Our second hypothesis was the main effect of criminal history. So we proposed that people will view police violence against people with a criminal background as more justified than against people without a criminal background. And we find strong support for that. So we can see in both model 1 and model 2 here, right, a pretty strong effect for criminal history. So when the citizen was presented, again, having an unrelated criminal history, not committing a crime at the time of the incident, people viewed violence towards that person as more justified. Third, we hypothesized the positive association between symbolic racism and justification of violence. And we also find support for that, a positive association here. So people who endorse these sentiments of symbolic or modern racism are more likely to view police violence as justified across both groups. Finally, we hypothesized the interaction effect, where we said, okay, the effect of evaluating violence towards a black motorist is going to vary based on your prejudice, specifically saying people who are higher on prejudice will view violence towards a black motorist as more justified. And we do find support for that final hypothesis right here. So the next slide shows this visually. So it's a little bit of a, not necessarily a standard graph here, but on our y-axis here, we have our dependent variable, justification of police violence. Our x-axis here, we have our symbolic racism score. The dark line here is the association when they're presented with a white motorist. So we can see, even when presented with a white motorist, people who are higher on symbolic racism view violence as more justified. However, that effect is even stronger, the dotted line here, among when presented with a black motorist. So we can see that once you get into the shaded area in the graph, that difference becomes significant. So everybody above this level on symbolic racism viewed violence towards a black motorist as more justified compared to a white motorist. So that effect does exist, but it's primarily among whites with high levels of symbolic prejudice. So our conclusions here, and I mean, there's so many issues that the paper sort of touches on. I probably will mention in the Q&A, you know, this was something we started working on 3 years ago, and it seemed timely then and even more so now. But we found, again, that respondents viewed police violence against individuals with a criminal record as more justified. And I think this was one of the main hooks of the paper that we kind of figured out as we went, was just how prevalent the criminal history aspect in these cases are. Almost every single one of these high profile cases, as Jay alluded to, after it occurs, in the debates about whether or not this was justified or what happened, the media obsesses about whether or not the victim, the citizen, had a prior criminal record, whether that's relevant at all to the incident. So it really does underscore this idea that's been in the literature for a while, that a criminal history is really a lasting stigma on people, that people use sort of a criminal history as a clear marker of two fundamentally different groups of people, sort of the law-abiding and the non-law-abiding. And they don't really, you know, it has a huge impact on how people are perceived. And I think it's a pretty consequential phenomenon given the extraordinary rates of incarceration we have in the United States. If we're ever going to wind down mass incarceration, you're going to have a lot of people coming out of prison, and many of them committed, you know, fairly significant crimes. Secondly, we found again that people who endorse symbolic racism also see police violence as more justified. And again, this is completely consistent with patterns we've seen in the literature and in politics, where there is just this link between sort of racial animus and support for aggressive policing more generally. And we can definitely get into this with some questions, but we can see this link being sort of, you know, front and center in the current political campaign. And even when we were working on this paper in the 2016 campaign, I don't know if people remember, but famously, then candidate Trump had tweeted out a blatantly false sort of meme that he had retweeted from white supremacist accounts, that I think it said that, you know, Black Americans were responsible for 91% of murders of whites, which was just an asinine statistic, completely made up. It had a fake source. And so, I mean, sort of this whole law and order approach has always been sort of tied into racial animus and sort of these dog whistles that really make a distinction between, again, law-abiding people in the suburbs and criminals in the city. And finally, we found that when looking at sort of whether or not just violence was more justified against a racial minority, we only really find that among white respondents with higher levels of racial prejudice. In this sample, and we can't generalize, but it was about 37% of the white respondents were in that area where they viewed violence as more justified toward Black citizens. The remaining 63% who were below that didn't really see much of a difference. And so I think that also is a pretty important pattern to sort of understand how people generally will be resistant to this idea that there's any sort of racial bias, like not only using these sort of cultural characteristics and the perceived criminality, but, you know, it isn't every person that views it this way. It's primarily the people who already tend to sort of have high levels of racial animus and also tend to support aggressive police more generally. So that's pretty much the end of the presentation. And I want to again thank Walter for hosting us and thank everybody for coming. I also want to mention publicly, in case we don't get to it, that this paper was supported by the UROP program. Jay got a UROP grant when he was a senior, still an undergraduate, and if not for that UROP money, we would not have collected the data and been able to do this research. So thanks to Monica Brockmeyer and Matthew Orr and the UROP program for their support.
So I guess questions are appropriate right now. So David, you will be our host, so you can decide who you want to recognize.
Okay. All right, Evelyn.
I wanted to know, what is the central question that you guys are asking? I was trying to write it down, I missed it.
Yeah, no problem. So the central question was whether or not people view police violence differently based on the race and criminality of sort of the target of that violence.
View police violence differently?
Mm-hmm.
And what?
Based on the race or criminal history of the target.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure. Patricia?
Thanks, Dave, and thank you, Jay, too, for a really interesting talk. So I have two questions. The first question is, I'm wondering if you also looked at an interaction between criminal history and race of motorist. That's my first question.
Yes, there was nothing there.
Okay.
So that was our original, you know, what our original sort of plan was, but there was not an interaction there. The criminal history really had a pretty consistent effect across both white and Black motorists.
Okay, that's interesting. So another thing that I'm thinking about, and I haven't done research with vignettes, but I was wondering about the order of which you showed these vignettes to people, because I'm also thinking that maybe the order, say if you're showing them first vignettes of Black motorist, and then they start answering questions about white motorist, so maybe that might bias how they're responding So anyway, I'm just wondering if
Yep,
you
no, that's a
order
great
of the
question.
vignettes was, and if you thought about how that might be influencing some of the responses that people were giving.
Yeah, that is a great question. That was a question that I think all the reviewers had. So in this case, there's sort of two ways to go about it. There's two philosophies. What we did is we present the vignette first. That's the first thing they saw after, agreeing to the survey. And maybe I should have said that we framed it as a news and information study. Oh, and actually, let me even go back because I'm remembering as I speak. The first thing they actually saw was a completely unrelated story, and it was about, Jay, do you remember? Environmental issue?
The change, yeah. I think it was the effects of climate change.
Yeah, so we first presented them with a not false, but a vignette, a story about climate change. And the study was framed as news and information study. And then they, after they read that and answered some of those questions, then they were presented with our vignette, the one we were most interested in. And then they were given the dependent variable and then the moderator. So I think the real concern would be if the actual manipulation, right? If you're presented with the vignette that described a Black motorist, particularly with the criminal record, maybe that would have an effect on the symbolic racism score, but we didn't find any evidence of that. There were no differences across the groups on any of the background variable. The other way to do it, if you wait until the vignette is at the end and you've already given them this racism scale, that's, sometimes people worry that that's sort of priming. It clues people in that sort of race and ethnicity might be part of the study. And so, there's sort of two ways of thinking about it. And I think that was a long answer to your question, but we did not see any evidence that, showing the vignette had an effect on the symbolic racism. Kahari, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, well, just more of a comment. It's funny, not a question, but a comment. Yeah, great presentation. You know what made me think about, I'm not suggesting that you do it, but it seems like Trump is listening, that the Trump campaign is probably also doing a similar type of research as well. Because, I mean, this is a rhetoric that he uses, and for someone that's does not have high levels of symbolic racism, people who don't watch Fox News may think this doesn't make any sense. Why does he keep talking about law and order and Black people invading suburbs and these right-torn cities? But your analysis suggests that it actually does make a difference among a certain population of whites, probably Black viewers and very strong Republicans, strong Trump voters specifically. And so it seems that he's banking on the fact that if he can espouse this rhetoric, that it will energize his base and they'll vote for him on that point alone. So yeah, I mean, that's my point. It seems like it's his team is probably doing some similar type of research as well. And it makes sense given the findings, why he keeps talking about law and order and right-torn cities.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think, Fox News definitely tends to be an older audience, obviously a more conservative audience, but I think also that maybe people underestimate how much of the sentiment is among millennials and younger people on social media.
Mm. Yeah.
Not to get too far afield of the presentation here, but it seems like we're pretty close to deciding that social media was just a mistake. But I think there's just so much false information on there and so many, sort of memes and bumper stickers that really make this link, and just sort of present outrageous presentations of Black criminality.
True.
David, Jeff Cantor has a question in the chat about whether or not you've been able to discern any geographical differences.
Yeah, we didn't find any evidence of that. There was no difference by urban rural. One interesting pattern that I think is people sometimes, you know, that surprises people is that actually men are less, you know, it's kind of a paradox because men tend to be more conservative, but they actually do tend to be less accepting of police violence, and probably because they tend to be the target of it more often. And men would be more likely people who would be treated harshly by the police. When you do these MTurk studies, you're pretty limited in sort of geographical diversity. And so we didn't really look at geography beyond just an urban rural. Taylor.
How are you?
I'm well, how are you? Nice to see you.
I'm good. Hold on one second. I'm sorry. It's connecting to something.
You're not driving, are you?
Okay, I see now. I hear you now. Okay. So question. In regards to the concern for the public, so would you say that your research is presenting, like, should we be concerned that there is some type of bias when it comes to police violence in regards to African Americans, or would it be that, or should the concern be that people don't recognize the, you know, the bias in it, like that it's so many people that are actually, sorry, I'm outside, that there are so many people that don't believe that there is bias when it comes to the police brutality against African Americans? Like, what is the exact concern?
Yeah, I think the concern is basically both of what you said. I think it was Omari in the chat here, and I just want to point out that, you know, it's one great thing about this format, despite all the downsides, is we have Omari here from Baltimore, a former student, and I saw Charles from Illinois. So we've got some people from out of town here. But Omari had put in the chat that another way that this plays out, and, you know, when you're sort of doing the research and you're trying to, you know, deal with comments from referees and things, you take some things out, you put some things in. But it's also this link that, you know, because of bias and racial patterns in law enforcement, Black Americans are also much more likely to have a criminal background, even, you know, net of offending. And so part of that effect of criminal history, the effect of race can be kind of tied up in there too, you know. And so that effect of criminal history that we saw, which is so consistent, is going to, in practice, be a lot more consequential when the incidence entails a Black citizen, because those are the people who are going to tend to be criminalized, and those are going to be the people who tend to have a background. I think Jay alluded to the Philando Castile. I mean, the quote that we have in the paper from that police officer is really stunning. He literally says, well, if this guy will smoke marijuana in his car, why wouldn't he kill me? I mean, you know, yeah, because that's, you know, the next thing you do is you shoot a police officer who just pulled you over. And I think outside of just the confines of the specific project, I think a lot of white Americans can't understand what it would be like to fear the police. And they can't understand why you would ever fear the police. I mean, some of the stunning things when you really look at these instances is just how quickly these things occur, right? Like the Michael Brown, I mean, regardless of what happened, it was only 90 seconds between the police officer telling him to stop jaywalking and then he's dead. You know, I mean, how quickly something like that can escalate, and then people will say, well, you know, he had been suspended from school, so of course the police were afraid of him. So I think, you know, I don't know if I answered your question directly, but it's sort of both of those things.
You did. And then just thinking about seeing some of the other videos and stuff like that where whites will get pulled over and white Americans, and they could have a whole gun in the cop's face and not get shot, barely get pinned down. I've seen white Americans beat cops and they're still living and breathing to tell the story, and it's crazy.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly right, because it's just an exact measure of, like I'm saying, so it's the context of being confronted by or stopped by the police is very different in the white suburbs than in the inner city. Um, and I think a lot of suburban whites can't understand that difference. They don't understand, like, if you are stopped by the police, this is a confrontation. You know, you're immediately suspected. They're afraid of you. You know, I mean, if I go out driving and I'm stopped by the police in Oakland County, I can guarantee you I'm not going to be dead within 5 minutes. It just would never escalate like that. And yet you have these other cases where just so quickly, you know, because I think from go, the police are looking at this as a confrontation, you know.
Dave, Professor Lynch has a question in the chat as to whether you measured the respondents' education or age.
Yes, so we had education was just college degree or not. And education, actually, surprisingly, people with a college degree viewed the violence against the motorist as more justified compared to those without a college degree. That was surprising. I don't really have an explanation for that one. And age did not have any impact. Again, when you do these MTurk studies, the age range is pretty restricted. Tend to be on the younger side. You don't have a lot of older folks who use that system to make small amounts of money for doing surveys. And so we did have both of those, and surprisingly, people with more education saw the violence as less justified. I think I see another hand over here. Jerry, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I was gonna agree with something that Kahari was saying, that you know, the correlation I think I see between that base that is immovable for our president and the 37% that you guys ended up coming up with. I think that there's probably definitely a direct correlation with that. And then you also said something about males being less or being more against the violence, or I'm not sure exactly how you worded it, but you said that women were more, and maybe it's just a thought, is that you know, the same way the media plays it out, that women may end up being more scared of these potential things that could happen to them, and therefore say that it's justifiable, you know, because they feel like it makes them feel safer. But my question was, you know, this whole thing was done with almost 600 white respondents. Is that what it was?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Did you guys ever think about having Black respondents?
Yeah.
Or a study similar to it with Black respondents?
Yeah, we did have Black respondents in the original data set, and then after I think the first round of revisions, we decided it was easier to just move forward with white respondents. I mean, I think the only issue is just if you have Black respondents in the same sample, the meaning of things like that symbolic racism scale just get a little bit, it's just a little ambiguous, you know. I mean, that was really designed to measure whites' racial prejudice.
Right.
And so, and I don't know, Jay, if you remember, don't really remember the original patterns that we had by race, but I could probably find the original version of the paper and send that to you.
I don't remember either, but I know we had around 1,200 respondents total, and then after eliminating all non-white, we ended up with the 595 white respondents.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys actually had about half and half at first.
Yeah, surprisingly, you get more racial diversity on that system than you might expect.
Yeah, I understand how I just feel like maybe a different, not a totally different survey, but a survey geared towards that, if you wanted to include that. It just piques my curiosity, that's all.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the first comment you made, I just thought, it definitely ties into what Kari was saying about, the political messaging and political parties probably doing similar research. I mean, we see, I think that this law and order message, whether successful or not, is primarily geared toward women, right? It's been the suburban housewives that he's protecting. And so I do think most surveys show women are more afraid of crime and are more supportive of policing than men.
Any more questions? If not, please unmute your mics and let us give them, let's clap them up, as they would say in the church.
Thank you, guys. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for coming.
Yes. Thank you so much. And Kennedy, you have something to say?
Yes, so on behalf of the Humanity Center, and just to give you a token of our gratitude, you both will be receiving a mask and a journal with our Humanity Center logo on, which I hope you guys will represent with pride. I'll be connecting with you two individually so that you guys can receive these gifts, whether it's dropped off in your mailbox or, but something that's safe because of COVID. But thank you two again. It was a wonderful presentation, wonderful engagement. And we're excited that this was such an accessible event, and we might have to invite you back next year.
All right, absolutely. We'll be there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending as well. We will be having another Brown Bag tomorrow. Same place, same time, same link.
Thank you.
Yes. And this presentation is being recorded, so we will be uploading it to the website once we get our webmaster approval. So yeah, saw that in the chat. Any last questions before we close out? All right, well, thank you all again, and have a wonderful day and be safe.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.